What are you going to do? Hi guys, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're moving a little bit away from Aristotle specifically and stepping into one of the most famous moral thought experiments in all of philosophy. And that is, all aboard, the trolley problem. And honestly, it's really exciting to talk about this because it's one of those philosophical debates that sounds simple at first, but the more you think about it, the more you realize that it's really not. And this problem, on top of philosophy in general, is really fascinating in that there really is no answer that feels completely right. Spoilers alert, no matter what choice you make, somebody is going to die. So philosophers created a hypothetical scenario that forces us to ask a question. Is morality about outcomes or is morality about principles? To organize today's episode, the trolley problem is really about three things: tension and conflict, responsibility, and action. So let's start with T, which is tension and conflict between moral systems. The original trolley problem is actually pretty simple, so let's imagine this hypothetical scenario. Imagine a runaway trolley that is speeding down a track, and ahead of it are 5 people tied to the rails, and if nothing changes, the trolley will run them over, and they will kill all 5 of them. But next to you is a lever. Now, if you pull the lever, the trolley will switch onto a different track where only one person is tied down. If you pull the lever, the trolley will run that one person over, and that one person will unfortunately be killed. So the question becomes, do you pull the lever? And most people say yes. I also thought this. When I first heard of the scenario, I also immediately thought pulling the lever made the most sense. Mathematically, it feels obvious, because numerically speaking, it's between killing one person versus 5 people. And of course, one person's death is very unfortunate, but it is better than that times 5. Saving more people seems morally correct. And this perspective connects to utilitarianism, and that is the ethical theory most associated with philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. These are philosophers that we're probably going to explore later. And utilitarianism argues that the morally correct action is the one that produces the greatest number of overall good and happiness for the greatest number of people. In other words, morality is judged mainly by outcomes and consequences. Now, if pulling the lever saves more lives overall, then according to utilitarian logic, pulling the lever is the ethical choice. But on the other side of the equation, we have the argument that even if pulling the lever saves 5 people, you are still directly choosing for one person to die, because you are pulling the lever. The trolley would not hit that single person unless you intervened and pulled the lever. And what happened was that you actively redirected death towards someone on purpose. And this is where the moral debate becomes pretty hard to resolve, because some philosophers argue that intentionally causing harm is fundamentally different from allowing harm to happen naturally. And this view is often connected to deontological ethics, especially philosophers like Immanuel Kant. Deontology argues that morality is based on rules, duties, and principles, and it shouldn't be about outcomes alone. And according to this perspective, certain actions can be wrong even if they produce better consequences overall. So, for example, let's say that I donated a lot of money to a charity, but I didn't do it just to help the charity. I did it for personal gain and for the charity to praise me because I seek attention and whatnot. But although that is doing good for the charity based on numbers because I donated money for them to continue their services, at the same time, my intentions are bad. So therefore, my action, although the consequence of the action is good, the intention and the morality and ethicality behind it isn't. So that is why, even if they produce better consequences overall, some actions are indeed wrong. So a deontologist might argue in the trolley problem scenario that, hey, you can't intentionally sacrifice an innocent person even to save more lives, because us as human beings should never be treated merely as numbers or merely as tools. And this is where it's really hard to resolve the trolley problem, because both arguments are very persuasive and morally compelling in different ways. Utilitarianism tells us that saving more lives is better. Deontology tells us intentionally harming someone violates moral principles. And honestly, this is really why the trolley problem became so famous, because there's no right answer. There's a conflict between logic and pure moral instinct. But this isn't the only version of the trolley problem. There's a second one. And that is the second variation, where you imagine the same runaway trolley speeding towards 5 people tied to the tracks. Now, this time there is no lever. There's only one track ahead of you, and the trolley can't turn anywhere else. This time, you're not a driver. You're actually an onlooker on top of a bridge, and the train is just going right underneath, like this way. And the only way to stop the trolley is to push someone off the tracks below. Because let's say you're standing on a bridge above the tracks, and then you notice the person standing next to you is a very large man. So if you push him over and push him to the tracks below, his body would stop the trolley, and of course he would die, but it does save the 5 people. Now, here is what's pretty fascinating. Earlier, it was between killing 1 person and saving 5 people. Most people just wanted to pull the lever because 5 people living is better compared to 1 person living. So that is why, mathematically, the outcome is exactly the same as the original scenario. But this time, people's reactions are different. Most people who are willing to pull the lever suddenly refuse to push the man now, myself included. And honestly, this is pretty confusing because it is something pretty important about human psychology that we just learned here. Apparently, people don't judge morality based only on outcomes. The emotional aspect of the action does change things as well. Because pulling a lever doesn't feel direct. It doesn't feel like you're actively killing the person. But pushing someone, physically shoving someone to their death, feels very personal, and it feels very violent for obvious reasons. And what happened was philosophers realized that human morality, not only by logic, is influenced heavily by emotional intuition and spur-of-the-moment outcomes. So a strict utilitarian might still argue the same thing as the original scenario, that it doesn't change anything. Pushing the man is correct because 5 lives are still being saved. From a purely numerical perspective, it's the same, and the outcome remains identical. But most people instinctively reject this conclusion. Why? One reason is that pushing the man feels more intentional. Now, in the original trolley scenario, the death of the 1 person almost feels like a side effect of redirecting the train. But in the bridge, the second scenario, the man himself becomes the tool to stop the trolley. He's the actual instrument, and you're directly turning a human being into a tool. He's almost like the lever in this case. And honestly, this is where a lot of people, including philosophers, start debating whether intentions matter more than consequences. So let's say we have 2 doctors in a hospital. The first doctor accidentally gives the wrong medication, resulting in 1 death while trying to help a patient. The second doctor intentionally kills 1 healthy patient to harvest organs that will save 5 dying patients. So yeah, utilitarian math might focus only on the numbers. But morally and emotionally, most people feel the second scenario is far worse because it involves direct intentional harm. And this becomes even more complicated when we apply it to real life. If there's a government deciding whether to quarantine an affected city during a deadly pandemic or epidemic, the quarantine, it may save millions of people overall, but it also traps a few innocent people inside dangerous conditions. So the question is sacrificing some people for the greater good morally acceptable? Or if there's autonomous self-driving cars in the future, as we're sort of seeing now, suppose a crash becomes unavoidable. Should the car protect its passenger at all costs, or should it save 1 passenger to save 5 pedestrians? And although it does seem abstract or hypotheticals at first, as you uncover and explore further into it, you realize that it's really not just about that. The technology and politics are forcing societies to deal with trolley problem style decisions constantly, even current day society. And personally, what scares me most about utilitarianism is that it can become extremely dangerous if taken so far. History is full of people justifying some actions by claiming they were necessary for the greater good. So if morality becomes purely about numbers and outcomes, people can start rationalizing almost anything. But at the same time, strict rule-based morality also creates some issues. Imagine refusing to pull the original trolley lever because you believe directly interfering is morally wrong. 5 people die, even though you could have saved them. And even if we change the scenario, the principle still applies. If it's not 1 versus 5 people, even if it is 1 versus 1 million people, a deontologist would argue the same thing. Don't pull the lever, because principally it's still wrong. A utilitarian would probably argue that refusing to act makes you partially responsible for those deaths as well. And honestly, that's why the trolley problem never fully goes away. Every answer creates new moral problems. But now let's move to the R, and that's responsibility and guilt. One of the most common questions that is asked after listening to the trolley problem is whether choosing not to act is still a moral choice. In the original scenario, if you do nothing, 5 people still die. And we do still have to remember that. Some philosophers argue that refusing to pull the lever doesn't make you innocent because your inaction still allowed preventable death to happen. But emotionally, many people feel less guilty when harm comes from inaction rather than direct action, and this creates a very, very strong psychological effect. In a first scenario, a lifeguard sees someone drowning and refuses to help even though they easily could. In the second, a person actively pushes someone underwater trying to drown them. Legally and emotionally, society often judges the second action more harshly, but we do have to remember the 2 people died inside of both of those scenarios anyway. So what happened was philosophers realized that humans separate killing from letting die, even when the consequences are similar, if not exactly the same. And honestly, this really reveals something very important about morality. Because as humans, we care a lot about our agency, our freedom, and our intentions. It matters to us whether harm feels direct or indirect. So yeah, the outcomes are mathematically similar, but emotionally they feel completely different. And now let's move to the final section, A for action versus inaction. The trolley problem ultimately forces us to confront what kind of moral system we actually believe in. Do you believe morality is about maximizing good outcomes no matter what? That would lead toward utilitarianism. Or do you believe certain moral boundaries should never be crossed because there's a fine line, even for good results? That leans more toward deontology. But, of course, not everyone acts at both of these 2 extremes, as in, we're not only utilitarian, we're not always deontological every day or every second of our lives. And I think most people combine both systems, sometimes with realizing it and sometimes without. People often use utilitarian logic in some situations, but switch to rule-based morality in others. For example, during natural disasters, governments often make utilitarian calculations about distributing resources to save the most lives they can. But at the same time, society still believes certain actions like torture or intentionally killing the innocent are morally unacceptable regardless of how many people are killed or regardless of the outcome. Even if that person survives in the end, the action itself is still wrong. And that's why we do combine both to a large extent. The trolley problem shows us that morality isn't as simple as we think it is. Human beings want ethical systems that feel logical, but our emotional instincts constantly complicate those systems as well. And one thing a lot of people find interesting is how differently people respond to these situations and scenarios. And that not only depends on just their personal opinion, but their personal opinion depends on their culture, their background, their personality, their emotional sensitivity, their religion, etc. Some people immediately prioritize numbers and outcomes for some reasons. Others instinctively focus on moral rules and human dignity for some reasons. And neither side feels completely right sometimes. If you always prioritize outcomes, morality becomes very cold and dangerous possibly. But if you always refuse to compromise moral principles, you may allow preventable suffering to continue. So the trolley problem is really fascinating and confusing because it's one of the biggest conflicts in ethics itself. Again, should morality focus more on consequences or on moral duties? So before we finish off this video, I don't want to say that this video is just for teaching you what the trolley problem is. Really, the point of this video is how influential this thought experiment became outside philosophy classrooms, just in our everyday life, because we can relate to it a lot. Psychologists use trolley problems to study our decision making. Neuroscientists study which parts of the brain activate during moral dilemmas. Legal scholars use reasoning when discussing public policy. And the reason why this problem became so famous is because it forces people into not being comfortable making a single decision, because none of them seem completely right. There is no perfectly clean answer. That's really the beauty of philosophy as a whole. So yeah, thanks for joining me in today's episode. Honestly, the trolley problem does sound like a simple hypothetical at first, but the more you think about it, the more it starts really dissecting your assumptions about ethics completely. And weirdly enough, I think that's exactly why philosophy is really beautiful, because it forces us to deal with questions that certainly don't have completely right or comfortable answers. Okay, bye guys. I'll catch you guys in the next episode.